All right, we good?
Yep.
Okay, so that's just my welcome screen. So we're going to move on to the next one. So I just want to talk a little bit about why I'm presenting this, because it seems to be child advocacy, and my portfolio now is volunteer engagement. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that to give an overview. So based on the complaint cases that I've seen over the last 6 months, about 50% of them have been about disability and alleged discrimination. So I think it's something we need to spend some time talking about. And I think it's important for us to do some work together to increase our understanding of the tools that are available for staff and volunteers to help them navigate these. And also, I'd appreciate us working together to identify gaps in our system that would support you and your volunteers in doing this work. And so we'll talk about some resources that are available right now. And well, I'll get to the agenda in a second. I also wanted to let you know that I'm not an expert on ADA or disability law at all, but I do have a passion for this work and for inclusion and program adaptations and accommodations that really help improve things for our youth and volunteers so they have access to our activities and programs. And so by doing that, we'll look at resources and tools that we currently have to help you work through accommodations and their requests and how to use those resources. And we're not going to spend a lot of time there. I'm going to show them all to you and talk about why how they're used. And but then if you need help with them, we can dig deeper one-on-one as you need them. We'll talk about how to have conversations with parents and youth about what they need, including what you can and can't ask in these kinds of situations. And then I'll share some real cases that I've been working with without identifying real identities, of course, and we'll work through those together. And in some cases, in those scenarios, I've changed some of the facts just to make it lead us to a conversation that I think is important. So you may or may not, you might, see things that you recognize or not, and that's okay. I'm not naming counties or names or anything like that. We're not going to spend time there. And then we really want to help youth build their confidence and self-advocacy skills so that as they mature, they feel safe enough in our programs to speak up if they have if they need something. And ultimately, the goal is to help young youth respectfully advocate for themselves as a necessary life skill. Unfortunately, we're not going to spend a lot of time there either, because we could spend, a whole day talking about that. And if this is really something that is important to you, we can revisit that and dig into that topic at a later time. But we'll talk about a few different tips and techniques in that area. And then finally, we'll work together on identifying those gaps. Okay? All right, so the resources, we're going to start there. And I am going to show each of these to you. So I'm going to stop the slideshow and then pull all these up, okay? So you should be able to see them. Okay, hang on, that's not the one I want first. The first one I want to show you is the ADA, 4-H ADA accommodation request. Do you see that on the screen? Somebody can just say verbally yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so this form is a form that you use, that you can use. This is not a required form. Okay, so if a parent mentions to you or to a volunteer, which is mostly where that happens, that they need an accommodation, to request an accommodation for their child, then the volunteer or you could say, hey, we have this form. It will really help us if you start by filling this out. Okay, so that's a form that you can use for that purpose. And we'll talk about a little bit more about this form and how to use it when we get to the conversation part. Okay, so know that that's available. And all these links are in the PowerPoint, which will be posted on the association website, as well as I'm going to give you a sheet of paper, basically, that has all the links in it. So we can post that as well as the recording and the PowerPoint itself, okay? Then there's an ADA accommodation request for material, equipment, and services. This is to be filled out by A&R staff only. So after they've completed the ADA request form and they say, hey, I need an interpreter, right, for my child, then you would fill this out and send it to Whitney primarily, and probably John Fox. And then we'll see how we can help you with that, the cost of that. There used to be a budget item for these things, and I'm not sure there is anymore. I'm not sure what our affirmative action office is actually currently doing to support these kinds of requests, but just know that that form also exists. But you don't give this to a parent. This is something we use ourselves, okay? Another form is, and this is a brochure. I don't know if you're aware of this brochure. It's a little bit of a mess, honestly. It was developed, I don't even know when. It needs to be reworked. So this is one of those things, like, you know, I think is what I would call a gap, because we should rework it. But the brochure does exist, and this is something you would give to your volunteers to help them understand our non-discrimination policy. So the content is still appropriate. And just know that it's a threefold, brochure, little flyer that you can copy and give to your volunteers at an orientation or any type of training that you're doing, just to remind them about our discrimination policy. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. And then we have, this is an old document. You can see it was developed in 2003 and 4 by the state ambassadors, so it's fairly old, but just know that this exists. It's an adult volunteer handbook about making 4-H more accessible. And this handbook has some good information. Some of the information here is old and no longer, it's not current. So it needs some updating and some work, or maybe this is something people might want to be passionate about. But it does talk about defining disabilities, gives some terminology, okay? And so it's a good little document, especially if you're working with volunteers who are needing some support around even understanding this topic. So you could start there, and all these are on the website, okay? The next one is 4-H practices for inclusion of individuals of all gender identities. Now this is available on our website, and once again, this is about gender expression. We've talked a lot about this in the last year, so I think that people are aware of this document, but just know that if this comes up on how to deal with gender expression, gender identity, you can help your volunteers understand how to work through those issues. Okay, this comes up often with camp in particular, and because you're dealing with housing and toileting and all those, and showering, and so it's important that they understand what our stance on that is. Okay, all right. The camp group did a webinar a couple years ago, or maybe it was just last year. Looks like last year. 2017, and this is a great video. Even though it's focused on camp, you can just easily substitute 4-H programs for the camp word, and everything in here is still applicable to inclusion and how to accommodate members who need accommodations or need a different way to do program. So I'm not going to repeat a lot of what's in here. There's good information here on how to have conversations, things to consider, how to include the parents. I am going to recap some of it, but if you want more specific details, this is a great video to go watch. Thank the camp committee for doing that. And then we have a 4-H disability policy FAQ. So this again can go hand in hand with the brochure I showed you earlier. And so you can use this to help answer some of the common questions that we receive, like, can we deny a request for accommodation? And then it gives you basically the only basis for saying no is if it would mean a fundamental alteration to the nature of the 4-H program or constitute an undue hardship to implement. Let's say whatever they're asking for costs, $5,000. Well, a club probably couldn't afford that, right? So is there something else we can do? So those are the kinds of questions that we usually get, and it answers those for you. All right. So those are all the documents that are mentioned in the slide deck, and I'm going to go back to that now. Okay. Okay, so we went through all those. Oops, sorry. Okay. So once again, like I said, all the hyperlinks are embedded in the PowerPoint, and they'll also be as an attachment. Okay, so now we're going to dig into really how to have that conversation, right? How to start to make a plan with a parent once they disclose. So it's really a process to get to that plan, and that's really acceptable to everyone, including the volunteers involved, you, and what the county can provide, as well as what the parent and the child needs. And it may take multiple conversations with multiple parties over a little bit of time. Some issues are solved quickly, and some take multiple conversations, some back and forth, and negotiating those. I think that one of the things we need to remember is that our parents are our partners in this, right? And so, and really for parents, the ultimate question is who's going to care about my child when I'm not there, right? That's at the back of their minds. That's really what's going on. It's like, how do I know? And how do I have confidence in that 4-H is going to care for my child the way I'm going to care for them? And so that's always something we need to take into consideration, and also try to approach our parents as our partners in helping their child have the best 4-H experience that they can. And you yourself may have all kinds of feelings about how you feel working through this. So what are some of the feelings that you've had when you work through these issues, or things that you think you might have? I'm going to go look at the chat pod. You can just write them in there. If I can see the chat pod, there we go. Any things that come up for you that when you've worked through these, like if you feel like sharing? There's only a few people on the call, so that sometimes it's hard to share what I feel or what I think when I'm working through this. And I can just say some of them. It's like, it's okay to feel anxious or nervous or like a little bit out of, like a fish out of water, those kinds of things, because these are oftentimes are new situations for us, and we don't always know exactly what to do. But your job is to set the tone, right? To seek agreements from all, that these conversations will be respectful in the spirit of the code of conduct and principles of community. It's like, it's okay for you to say, look, I'm not an expert, but we have access to experts, right? And you're going to utilize all your resources to help work through this situation so that everyone's comfortable in the end with the plan.
Shema, there was a comment in the chat box from
thanks.
John.
So John says initial communication is important. Yeah, absolutely. And we had a case 12 years ago with a girl going to SLC. Yep. So that initial communication is super important. And as we go through each of these steps, we'll spend some time on each one of these, talking about how to really manage those. Thanks, John. Okay. So if you think a conversation is really out of your comfort zone or your expertise, get help from your supervisor or contact a neighboring peer even. It's so, you have relationships with your peers in a neighboring county or even across the state, and seek help from them or an advisor if you have one. And if you don't, once again, we have advisors across the state who could help you. And certainly you can contact the state office. You want to contact me, especially if you're working with a parent. So where I get involved is if it involves volunteers, and almost all these cases do, because a volunteer needs to make an adaptation, and then a parent is involved in the conversation. So that's why I'm involved in these conversations. And where the child comes into it, that's where Whitney gets involved, or sometimes Shannon if there's a behavior issue. So there's a lot of crossing over here at the state office, but you can always reach out to me initially, and then we'll make sure it gets to the right place if it needs to go somewhere else. Okay, so we're going to dig into each one of these individually. Why won't my slideshow go forward? There we go. All right, so with the initial conversation, so while you may learn about a request for accommodations through an initial email, what we're learning is that in most cases, parents really want to talk about their child's needs. So I would make time for face-to-face meetings as much as possible, or at least telephone conversations, so that there's a dialogue and it's not just email back and forth, okay? And you can do that through Zoom meetings as well, just so that there's some kind of opportunity to have a conversation. If they haven't already given you very specific information about the requested accommodations, sometimes the email says, I need an accommodation. Okay, well, what, the next question is, what kind of accommodation? And so then you would that's an opportunity where you could send them the form. But if they've already spelled it all out in a great big email, and exactly what they need and why, you don't need to use the form again, okay? So tell them you take their request very seriously, that you'll help them work together to come up with a plan. And they also include your child. You want to make sure that their child is included in a partnership atmosphere with the adult, because that's what we do in 4-H, right? So we want adult volunteers working with their child. So this will be a dialogue between several parties, including their child if their child's old enough. So we want to make sure that you're also navigating feelings in that during that time. Sometimes parents are afraid to bring it up, right? Sometimes it's an invisible disability and they're afraid that we're going to label their child or do something totally different outside of our norm that they don't want. They want their child to have the same experience as everyone. So it's hard for them to bring up the conversation. So they may be timid. They also may come ready to do battle, right? And so they can be angry, upset, and oftentimes when they're working through IEPs in the school district, they're pretty much taught that they have to come in ready to do battle and advocate for their child pretty strongly. So they learn these things through the school system because it's oftentimes hard to get services for your kids through the school. So you may have to dig a little deeper to have some extra compassion for them and for yourself as you work through this process in the conversation. So after you've asked them to complete the ADA request form by a certain date, like if they've already given you the details, like I said, don't make them do the form again. You can use the content in the email as your form. Okay.
Emma?
Yeah.
There's a question from Scott.
Oh, yeah. Let me see it. Hang on, it takes a while. Are we allowed to ask why specific? No.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what I'm getting to next. Good segue. Thank you, Scott. So here's the thing. You can only ask a parent to complete the form if they've already asked you for an accommodation or stated that their child needs an accommodation. So, and you're not really allowed to ask why. Okay, parents typically will say, I need this accommodation because my child has, okay, let's just do a less obvious one, but that's obvious, that it's an obvious accommodation need. My child has a hearing loss, and so they need to sit in the front of the room, or whatever that is, right? They'll usually tell you what it is. They may not want to give you a diagnosis, and you can ask, okay? What you can do is review the health history and their policies around this. Every time these issues come up, it's good to go back to policies, right? And check and see, remind yourself what the policies are around these. I always do that, and I've been dealing with a lot of these cases in the last 6 months, but I don't remember easily, or I want to make sure that I remember the right way, right? So you want to ask, or you want to review those policies every time. Is there another question? Oh, okay. All right. So review their health history. Did they write anything in their health history? Oftentimes you can find it there. It's like oftentimes they don't write an accommodation request there, but they will say that my child has ADHD. That's fairly common for a parent to write that. And then if they've written in their health history, you can tell them, I reviewed your health history. I see that he has ADHD. And so let's, work through some of these requests and helping your child navigate whatever it is they're bringing up. Okay, but let them guide the conversation. All right, it's really important to parrot, really, and paraphrase back to them what they've already said without making assumptions about a diagnosis or anything like that. You want to include others that need to know this information, that you're working on a plan, and then invite them to a meeting. Okay, so we want to arrange a meeting with a project leader, community club leader, whoever's involved in this. Okay. And you want to document all the conversations with detailed notes and do an email follow-up. Because I'm suggesting you have conversations face-to-face, people get concerns like, but then I haven't documented it, so I only want to do everything through email, right? So that I have a paper trail. It's like, that's not absolutely necessary, because then the way you deal with that is it's following up from the conversation, write down what was said, what was agreed to, include dates and times of the conversation, who was involved in the conversation, and try to capture that in some notes. And then email that follow-up to everyone saying, this is what we talked about, this is what we agreed to, and these are our next steps. And that's how you do that documentation of the conversation. And then if someone says, no, I don't remember it that way, then you have that, then you do some back and forth there. Okay? Or you may say, oh, sounds like we need to get on the phone again because it sounds like there's some confusion still, and that's okay, because that's our next conversation. All right? And that's a good habit for any conversations you're having with volunteers and parents, right? Is to document after the fact what happened, especially if you think it's a situation that may escalate for some reason or become something bigger than it is in the moment. Okay? So important tips here are to only parrot back what the parent has already said to you. You don't want to, we're not in the business of labeling or providing a diagnosis unless a parent has already used a term, all right? You don't want to state it. So if a parent has already said, my child has ADHD, you could say that back. You could use that term then. If their child has the diagnosis, they've shared it with you, you know what it is, you can talk about it. But what you want to do is focus on the behaviors that we're trying to, and I'm not using the word behaviors as a bad thing. I'm just using what is it that we need to accommodate, right? Okay. The next step. So that's the initial conversation. So then you want to research on the specific situation. So after you have all the details from the ADA form and the health history, do some research about reasonable accommodations for that specific situation. You can find all kinds of information. There's all kinds of resources and tools out there. You can certainly call us for support on recommendations on where to look. And we already have quite a bit of that stuff, okay? You want to talk to your community club leaders and your program leaders, project leaders, and talk to them about how they think they can adjust to meet the needs that have been required or requested. So remember that if a request fundamentally changes the 4-H program, it's not required to make that change. But what you want to do is say, okay, so what the parent has asked us to do may not be possible because it fundamentally changes the way we do things. But all modifications are a change to a program in some degree. So you have to really think about balancing that. And it's a change to the program, at least at some degree, for that child. But if it changes it for everyone, is it still doable? Is it still okay? So we just need to, the key here is to think about, is it a reasonable request and something we can actually accommodate, okay? And then you ask the community club leaders, if you can't do that, what can you do, right? If the situation is, whatever it is, saying, okay, the one example I used earlier, my child has a hearing loss, is it okay if we designate a seat for this child in the front of the room? Well, that seems like a reasonable request, right? That's easy to do, something that can be done. But if the parent said, so all of their project leaders have to be done one-on-one and they have to be separate from the rest of the kids because other noises distract them. That's probably not a reasonable request. You can't ask a project leader to hold special meetings for one child at another time. So what is it that they could do instead, that if the child has anxiety in larger groups or working with other kids? And so that would be a conversation back and forth. Let's see, there's a chat question. Are we allowed to ask for supporting documents from a doctor, counselor? No. Okay. If the parent offers, certainly you can look at it, but we shouldn't ask for those things. And that's where our job sometimes becomes hard, because you go, well, do we really trust what they're saying? And honestly, our intention is that, yes, you have to just believe what the parent is telling you, okay? Especially when it's about a disability or accommodation request. To a reasonable degree, that's that reasonableness that comes in, okay? So this is that back and forth. This is that, and these conversations can go back and forth several times. And your job in these situations is to facilitate those meetings and conversations. Okay. I thought there was another question. You may have to facilitate the conversation between the parents, project leaders, and the club leaders, at least to get them started. And in some cases, once you give the project leaders and club leaders some tools and they know what they're doing, they might say, I got this, you know, I'm a teacher, I'm a principal, whatever, I deal with this all the time. And then it's okay if you're not there, as long as everyone, especially who your leaders are comfortable having these conversations, and they're keeping you in the loop about what the final agreements were about the accommodations. Okay, so it's okay to turn that over to a volunteer if they're comfortable doing that. Okay, so some tips on this in this particular step is to ask the parent. This is where that child advocacy piece comes in. You want to early on ask the parent if they want their child to be present at planning meetings. And at least in most schools in California, when they're about in the 5th grade, they're their children are encouraged to come to their IEP meetings. So that's a normal situation in the school. And I think that's a good benchmark to use. So about 11 years old, this is when we want to start including the child and helping develop the plan that will work for them. So what you're doing is modeling for that child. It's like, this is how you advocate for yourself. And it isn't a must-do, but it certainly is something we can advocate for, saying by the time they're 11, what we want to demonstrate is helping children use the language and understanding these conversations can be respectful, and, you know, we're all here to help them succeed. And so how do they use the right words to really let people know that they have a need right now, and this is what they would like to have happen, okay? And we can only really do that if kids feel safe enough to be in that environment to advocate for themselves, right? And then they have the language and skills to really talk about what they need. So when youth members are included in the meeting, be sure to use great youth-adult partnership techniques during that time to ensure that the member has a voice in the accommodation, so that their voice is being heard. They're not just sitting in the room being talked at or about, that they're actually actively part of the conversation. And then you want to stay on top of this. This is another tip at this point, because you don't want this to go on too long. 30 business days max, or shorter if possible, because what we want to do is get to the final plan so that everyone is agreed, and then the members can move on with their 4-H life in general. And then, as I mentioned before, if the accommodation requires specialized equipment or materials, complete the ADA request for equipment form and submit it to Whitney and John Fox. Okay, so that's something that would probably happen at this stage. Okay, there's one more step here, and then I'll have time for Q&A a little bit before we move on to the next steps. So then we want to finalize agreements and finish up that plan. So as I said before, dialogue can be short or it can take a longer amount of time. And the goal is really to reach the point where everyone agrees and a written plan is created. So be specific about the goals you're trying to achieve and the accommodations that will be in place for the child in each setting where issues potentially occur, okay? You don't have to have a list for every single event, though. It's like, that's not what I'm asking. I'm saying, in general, list situations that are unique that could come up. And so, for example, a child that gets high anxiety and can't speak when they're in a situation with more than 10 people, that member might be fine in project meetings because there might be only, 6 or 10 kids in that meeting, and it might be okay. But if it's in a club meeting, can we find an alternate way for them to participate in club meetings? Can they do that via Zoom? Can they sit, even be physically present? but sit in another room and be on Zoom so they're not overwhelmed by all the people in the room. If they have to do a presentation, can they present to a small group instead of the large group? So think about how we adapt situations to the needs of that child. And then you want to communicate that plan only to those that need to know the information on the accommodation, okay? And you may need to coach your volunteers on what the accommodation should look like and by when. And you also may need to talk about privacy, in that they shouldn't mention, discuss, or bring up the child's situation in front of others. And we'll see an example of that when I get to case studies. But if something comes up, be sure to talk to the parent privately at another time. So you want to coach your volunteers on how they navigate working with the member and their parents about their particular situation, that they should have private conversations and not bring it up at all. They shouldn't necessarily be treating the member in any other way than they would treat any other member. All right, encourage the parent to update their health history form with the specific accommodations that are agreed to. It really helps, and it's important because volunteers change from time to time and actually from activity to activity. So if it's on their health history what the accommodation was, then if, club leader knows, but then member goes to SLC, if they haven't written it down, we may not know that that's an accommodation request. And so if that's documented in their health history, that's the best way to do that. Some parents will resist that. They don't want to write that down. They feel, I don't know, they're concerned about privacy. They're concerned about their child being treated differently. But as much as you can, encourage them to update their health history with the information and explain why that's important to them. Okay, because we want to make sure that we're providing that continuum of care across all of our programs. And then once again, yeah, document again.
Here.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, I have a question around that. Is there a capability within the 4-H online system where we can upload subsequent files or information about the kid that was shared with us by the parent?
That's a good question. I don't know that 4-H Online has an upload feature at the moment, but I think that the box that says, if there's a question that says something about any information that you'd like to share about helping your child be successful, that kind of thing. And I think it's a text box that's big. Like it doesn't take just 25 characters, I think. But let me clarify. I don't think we have an upload feature, but if that would be helpful, since they're building online for 2.0, maybe that's something that we want them to be able to do.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, so that way the staff can also upload it. So as in the scenario that you just brought up, if it goes to SLC, there's additional files provided.
Right. So that could be a gap that we've identified right now that we have. That's great. That goes on our gap list. I like it. Thank you, Charles.
You're welcome.
Okay. Okay, so that was a lot of information. Are there any questions right now before we go on?
4-H online does not have that capacity.
I didn't think so. Scott confirmed that 4-H doesn't have an upload feature. I didn't think it did. But. Okay.
Questions, anybody?
We've asked a few kind of along the way. So, but yeah, if you think of them, just write them and we can come back to them. Okay.
One note that, Gemma, I was going to suggest that as you were going through this, it would really be helpful maybe to have like a FAQ or, like a 2-pager or 1-pager in terms of when you're dealing with this is what you do start at the meeting, all that stuff.
Right. So in my slide deck, everything I just said is in the notes. So you've got not just the slide deck, you've got everything I'm saying.
Great.
Okay. So that will give you the kind of the text and the context. And then at the end, I'll talk about how we use this with volunteers as well. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. But we could do an FAQ as well, but sometimes I like it all in one place, so you don't have to go back and forth. But we could write a script if we need to. All right. let's go on then. We're going to do some case studies, okay? So I'm going to give you some information that are real cases that we worked with over the last 6 months or so. And then where a diagnosis is important to share, I've done so, and it's information that we had, but where it's not important to the conversation, I've avoided it. In all of these cases, the disabilities are essentially invisible. And so I think it's important to think about that. It's like when you think about invisible disabilities, what do you think are some of the challenges there that working with invisible disabilities? And since there's so few people, just go ahead and we can just unmute everybody and you can just talk.
Difficulty is if they don't disclose it, and you have no, someone in a wheelchair, that's pretty obvious, but those
Right.
hidden ones are the ones that kick you in.
Well, I think one is, and I dealt with this, let's say 2 years ago, is depression and being medication on depression and not taking the medication. I basically had a youth act out and in a manner that was abusive towards an animal, and lo and behold, as we go further back and ask questions, it was tied to those issues that the parent really never shared with us. So
Right. Yeah, they can surface later, right? Most times our invisible disabilities are ones that don't come up. A parent, for whatever reason, like I said earlier, is like they're hesitant to share it because they don't know what's going to happen with that information. They don't want their child treated differently, whatever their reasons are for not sharing until there is a problem, right? And then it's almost like an emergency crisis kind of thing. And if they had just told us ahead of time, we could have maybe avoided all of that. But unfortunately, that's not the case in most cases. They come up later. So that's the big challenge with invisible disabilities. More and more with ADHD, that one that has behavior things attached to it, parents typically share that because they've shared it at school, right? But so just think about that. Just because a child has a behavior doesn't necessarily mean they're just a kid with behavior challenges. There could be, like Charles, you said, some underlying thing, and that's when these conversations help us get to that bottom line. And then
well,
how
I
do
think
we help the child?
also, oh, Gemma,
Yeah.
if I may, I think another factor level to that is the mental health stuff. And in this society that we live in, mental
Right.
health is something that has a stigma tied to it. So people have a harder time disclosing. And that would be the same
Yep.
with the LGBT issues and gender issues. So I think that we need to be be extra vigilant, maybe. I don't know on that one. It's really difficult, and
It is.
we
Yeah.
really have to deal with it as much as we can.
It's going back to that earlier statement that I made, is like sometimes digging real deep to that level of compassion, right? It's like we all have it. That's why we're in this business to some degree. It's like, but sometimes we have to go really deep to dig down to that. It's like we don't know everyone's story, right? We don't know
Right.
family stories. And so just taking several deep breaths and backing up and going, okay, let's include the parent as our partner in this conversation so that we can
Oh,
get
yes.
your child to success, right? Okay, so I'm going to read aloud each of the cases, and you can read along with them. I'm going to show them to you, and then I'll ask I'm going to ask some questions that we can all discuss, and we'll just go from there. All right, case number 1. So, due to a long-term heart condition, a 13-year-old member tires easily. She gets overheated and has short-term memory loss. The parent has requested accommodations of extra breaks, staying out of the sun, adjustment to project completion if they can't attend a meeting because they have to rest. Additionally, the parent requests make-up meetings when the member forgets to attend. The parent is additionally upset because on one occasion, a project leader said to the member, "How's your heart? Are you up to teaching this skill today to the junior members?" All right, so thinking about that case, let's talk about the reasonableness of the accommodation. So looking at that, how reasonable do you think those requests are?
Seems reasonable to me.
The only one I think that may not be able is, it depends on how many makeup meetings, I would say, because of the project leader's time. It depends on how many would be able to be made up. It would be my only concern.
Mm-hmm. Do you see a fundamental difference between that request? Oops, didn't want to do that. And the others?
Well, I guess too, I would put some onus on the parents too to, it says that the child forgot to attend the meeting, and the parent could, help out with that as well. Missing a meeting is one thing, because of help, but, the parent ought to take some responsibility in this as well.
Yeah.
And in this case, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Gemma, now that you brought that up, I would say it depends on the project too, because perhaps if the project is an outdoor related, staying out of the sun would be an additional challenge that, what if it's a backpacking activity that might not be the best fit with the child. I mean, with heart condition and all that stuff. I mean,
right.
So I guess at some point we kind of need to consider also what project or what activity that they are would be a best fit with the child. We're not going to say it's not allowed, but just to say what would be a better fit.
In this case, they were livestock projects, but what the project leader did was that they put up a pop-up. And so when she was doing showmanship skills, she was able to be in the shade. And so that was a really simple fix. And actually all the kids appreciated it, right? So all the kids used the pop-up. And so it was perfectly fine. So let's go back to this fundamental difference here. So what the county decided is that even though the member has memory loss, that the accommodations that she needs, like doing a presentation, she might need to have note cards for that, and that was perfectly fine. So her educational components were adapted to her memory loss, but the parents bear some responsibility for helping the member remember to get to her meetings. And so for getting a meeting, they said the parents really need to own some responsibility there. So you're exactly where they went to and said, wait a minute, she's only 13. It's not like she's 17 and driving herself and the parents have no participation or support in helping her get there. Because obviously the parents are completely involved in initiating this conversation, right? So there was some back and forth there about that accommodation and that request, and where it really was an educational adjustment in addition to parent responsibility. So they had that conversation, which actually went really well. It was a little, the staff member was nervous to have that conversation, but it ended up being fine to do that. And then my last question here is let's look at what the project leader said and say, so what would you do to support that project leader having heard this?
It sounds like it came from a place of genuine sincerity, but I think just giving strategies to not point out the actual issue, because obviously there's concern around being singled out, and maybe it's just how are you today, like they would do with every other young person there, and then not letting the young person advocate for themselves if they're not up for the skill. It's the young person's responsibility to advocate, maybe.
Exactly. And so that was the conversation, is that the staff coached the volunteer on not, it was the first question, how's your heart, wasn't a necessary conversation, right? It wasn't part of that, and reminding the project leader about protecting the child's privacy. And he could easily ask any child, it's like, are you up for teaching this skill today? You know, and just letting the child, like you said, say yes or no, and then moving on to the next member if they said no. And so, but we didn't have to say that in front of everybody, right? Okay. Anything else anyone wants to share about this case? Questions you have? Okay, that one's pretty straightforward.
You couldn't tell us anyway.
That's true. That's very true. Okay, case number 2. A longtime volunteer who has been disruptive and undermining staff for many years and CV authority for the past 5 years. I ad-libbed there, sorry. Suddenly, after 5 years, sends an ADA complaint and demand letter to UCA and our affirmative action officer. She claims that she's profoundly deaf and demands that devices and or captioning services are provided to her at every club, county, and state event or meeting that she attends. Her health history form has continuously indicated that she is hard of hearing. No other information is in her files or in past complaints. Okay. So what would you do in this case? What would be kind of like your first steps?
Charles here. I would treat it like any other ADA complaint that you've listed. Going to go through the steps. I mean, I think the disruptive behavior, that's good to know, but really we need to focus on the complaint and what they're asking for given the current situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think treating the two separately, I mean, the behavior may be out of frustration, it may not be, but almost, you know, I think starting with a conversation with the person themselves, the volunteer, and just finding out what their role is, and in each of those things is a starting point, because I mean, some of what they're asking for is, one, very expensive, and I don't think reasonable, but trying to find that middle ground of what is, and I don't know what that would be.
Yeah, so what forms might you use to help navigate this case?
Oh.
And that's for everybody, not just you, Scott.
Yeah.
And remember?
Was that state form that only staff would fill out?
Right.
Request if the state had any items that meet that.
Yeah. So based on her complaint, you could go back to her and say, okay, make sure I understand. These are the things you're asking for. And let the volunteer know you're going to work with. She already knows who the affirmative action officer is because she sent a complaint already, right? So she's aware of that. And just say you're going to work with our affirmative action office to see what we can do, our state office, to help support this and what we can do. So yeah, fill out that form, send it in, start a conversation with me. We've done some work because of this case on arranging for captioning services, and so that worked pretty well. We explored FM devices because she had asked for both FM devices and captioning. We decided just to do captioning services and try that, and they're about $65 an hour. And so what we're doing is working with the county on how does the county support that in the VMO's budget. And then how does the state support that as well or match it? And it's kind of a case-by-case basis. And then at the club level, we said the club needs to provide those services if that's important and build it into their budget. So, but then it's still that back and forth. In this case, they asked her to complete the ADA request form each time because it was too hard to know which meetings is she coming to, especially countywide and statewide. So that's what they've asked this particular volunteer to do. And it hasn't been onerous for that volunteer at this point because she understands that, you know, we have to, every situation might be a little different. Like we might decide that we really need an FM device in one situation and captioning in another. But yeah, it was really about separating her disruptive behavior and all the other things that were going on with this volunteer and addressing the accommodation requests separately.
Was she still disruptive after she got her hearing?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's okay. That's a whole nother story. Okay. Any other questions about that before I move on? Or thoughts? So yeah, just working through using the right forms and thinking about how you use them. Like I said, the example in this case was that we used the ADA accommodation request form every time. And they asked her to submit the form within, 20 days prior to each event so that they had time to figure out how they're going to provide the accommodations she requested. And you can do that. All right, case number 3. A parent has aggressively complained several times during the past year that volunteers aren't properly trained to work with youth with special needs. She has 2 members. The intermediate member is on the autism spectrum. She cites vague instances where her senior member has been chastised and made to cry. I'm going to ad-lib a little bit here for not following the rules or being late to meetings and not, doing what she's supposed to do. The parent explains that the younger child has special needs and they can't always get places on time because of those needs and working with them. And she advocates that the senior member should not be penalized for this. The parent refuses to complete an ADA request form, an accommodation form. And after many months, the parent finally reports via email to staff that her older daughter was barred from enrolling in a project because of the potential that she will be late.
Ouch.
Yeah. So what are the issues in this case? What do you see as the issues going on here?
Almost.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, we don't have a request for accommodation coming from the parent. Sounds like clearly documented.
Right.
And it also sounds like it appears that there's some retaliatory, not against the older daughter, but we don't, again, know we don't know what's really going on. But from this, it seems like the older daughter is getting, the senior member's getting penalized for stuff that's out of her control.
I'm just not sure what vague instances mean.
Yeah.
Vague means that they weren't specific. She didn't, early on in the game, she didn't say that her daughter was barred from enrolling in a project. She just said she was being mistreated. So using words like, we have a disability, volunteers should treat all youth with special needs with different types of skills and respect, and they don't have those skills. And so, but they were all vague statements like that. It's like, what is it that you really want us to do? And it took pretty much the whole year to get to this place where there was information that she was barred from enrolling in a project. Okay, so that we can deal with, right? Mm-hmm. So early on in the complaint process, it wasn't anything to hold on to for the county to be able to deal with this issue. And because the parent refused to complete the form, but then finally they have an email that basically said, this is what's happening and this is what I want to have happen instead. And so that they can deal with. So that was an issue, that they didn't have enough information and the parent refused to give it over time.
I think that's really key. You're right on that. And I think that in this kind of a scenario, this is where the face-to-face meeting that you had mentioned, starting with a safe place and a face-to-face meeting, helps a lot. And just to say, hey, help me figure out what's going on here. I know there's issues. I know there's a lot of, tell me, really, I mean, let's meet, let's talk. I'm really concerned. I want to be here for you, but I can only do it if I understand what is going on, and have a face-to-face meeting and go from there and kind of sort it out, because you might find out there are issues that the parent even has in terms of getting, expressing things for themselves, whatever. There's a lot of, or it may be a communication style. It can be tied to cultural issues. We don't know. But a face-to-face meeting can really help to begin to bridge and understand what's going on here, it sounds like.
Right. So that's a good place. That was my next question. Is like, how would you deal with this? What would you do? And so I think that initial, it's face-to-face, let's have a dialogue about what's going on might help get to it more quickly, maybe. But that's my recommendation, as I said early on. Those face-to-face or telephone, whatever it is, Zoom calls, if they can't physically come to your office, are really important to set the stage for that. Anything else people would do to handle this?
I was going to be wise guy and say call Gemma.
And they did. Yeah. Yep.
Oh yeah, have a face-to-face with Gemma.
I try not. You want to save me till the very end of the road, right? If you've gone a whole year and you just can't get anywhere, yes, I can, and I'm willing to come down and help mediate conversations with parents, especially if they're really hard or sticky or messy, or they've totally disregarded you and everybody, and it's just we're not getting anywhere. Save me till the end, though, right? So, because you want them to see you as the authority and the person that is your go-to. Not, they don't want to see me as that. But we would work as a team, certainly, on making sure our messages were the same and supporting the same conversations. But yeah, save me till the end. More importantly, what I think is more like proactive that you may want to use me for is to come in and do some trainings with your volunteers, like ahead of time. And we'll get to that in a second if we're done with case studies. Yeah, you ready to move on to there? Because actually we're at the end of time. Sorry, I knew I had more information than we could do in an hour. Do you have a few more minutes? We're almost done. If you can stay on, that'd be great. If you can't, I understand. This is recorded. You can come see the end. Okay.
I'll be here. Keep
Okay.
going.
So the next step I wanted to do was identify gaps, and maybe this is what we don't do, is that we can come back and do a follow-up, or since there's so few people on the call, we can do that via email. But I really wanted to get that as like, what gaps do you think we have? Or you can think about this and then just email me things we need to work on together in any kind of category related to this topic that will help your volunteers and our staff increase their knowledge and skills in this area. So just, think about that, send me your ideas, and we'll see what we can do. We've already identified that the handbook needs to be updated, and we'll work on that. And then Charles, the whole 4-H online upload feature, if we can do that, or a way to capture those accommodation requests in the health history online. So thanks for joining me today. The recording and the PowerPoint will be posted on the California Association website. I'm also going to send to Charles just a Word document that has all the links to those documents that we talked about. So it's easy just to, download that Word document and click on them. You can also search on the website if you want, but I thought I'd put them all in one place for you. This PowerPoint, if you want to share it with volunteers, I'm happy to have you do that, or I can come and do it. It's not volunteer ready at the moment. We wouldn't really want any volunteer to be able to identify a member based on the cases, and the cases need some tweaking, I think, to be really relevant to a volunteer audience. So I would frame the cases and the questions a little bit differently for volunteers. And I would probably, there's some of the language in here I would change a little bit. So at this point, if you all are, you want to use it in a couple weeks or something, let me know, because I'm not going to modify it today for a volunteer audience, but I am willing to do that work. I just have some other things that are, on the higher level on my pile of stuff. And so if someone contacts me though, I need this on, September 1st, I'll move it to the top of the pile. So I will certainly do that. I'm going to do it anyway. I just might not get to it until someone says, hey, I need that. Okay. Anything else for the good of the group? Okay.